everybody. My name is VParks and welcome to my presentation of 6 objects of Egyptian history. It was very difficult to do because there's just thousands and thousands of them to choose from, but I managed to select 6. So let's put on our expedition hat and get started.
Object number 1. For my first object, I selected a small statuette of Imhotep. The photographs are my own from the Imhotep Saqqara Museum. It is perhaps a bit unusual, as it is not a contemporary statuette of Imhotep from the 3rd dynasty. Rather, this item spans about 2,000 years. I believe we all admire Imhotep as the architect of Djoser's Step Pyramid and Complex. It marked an important stage in Egyptian history as the start of constructing monumental buildings from stone, and they were meant to last an eternity. Imhotep was always remembered, and by the late and Ptolemaic periods he was worshipped as a god. So this statuette is from the very late period of Egypt, worshipping a figure from one of the earliest periods. The base has the name of Imhotep with given life, and then I'm not sure what the rest is. You will also notice Imhotep has some mysterious object tucked into the clothing on his chest. This version is not very common. The Saqqara Museum doesn't have a good catalog. However, there were many of these statuettes made, and the Brooklyn Museum has a very similar example, also with something tucked in. Object number 2. My second object is from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It is the triad of Menkaure with Hathor and a hair gnome deity. It is actually one from a set of similar triads, perhaps 8, with different gnome deities. The triads were found at his Valley Temple by George Reisner in 1908. It's just amazing that these Menkaure pieces survived intact, and they are stunning works of art. They have all their noses. This triad shows Menkaure smaller than Hathor, and I don't believe the others are like this. Menkaure ruled near the end of the 4th dynasty. His passing marked the end of the giant pyramid building at Giza, and his pyramid was the smallest for a pharaoh. After the 3rd and 4th dynasties' frenzy of large stone pyramid building, it is said that the treasury could no longer support such major works, and this period ended forever. Pyramids were going to be smaller and using different techniques. Menkarure's large mortuary complex was completed by Shepsefkat, which is unusual. However, he was worshipped for many years beyond his death. One could imagine he was well respected and beloved. Object number 3. The last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty was Unas, or sometimes Wenis. The Old Kingdom was well on its way to decline at this point. His mark in history is the pyramid and mortuary complex he constructed. Although the pyramid is one of the smallest of the royal Old Kingdom pyramids, the causeway that leads to it was built to rival that of Khufu's. The Pyramid of Unas is the first time we see the pyramid text, which consisted of almost 300 magical spells to assist the king in his afterlife. A sort of early Book of the Dead. But the focus of this selection is not the pyramid, rather something found in the causeway. The causeway was richly endowed with relief carvings, and quite an unusual block is on display at the Saqqara Imhotep Museum. I took this picture of it. The carving was quite a mystery. It apparently shows emaciated, starving people, leading one to believe that the people of Egypt were experiencing famines and very hard times. In the last 50 years, additional research has led Egyptologists to believe a different story. The scene is illustrating nomadic desert dwellers living outside the borders of the Egyptian kingdom. The pharaoh Unas is demonstrating his concern for these people, and he assisted them with food to enable their survival. This block highlights how bad the situation was. We can be reminded of modern-day pleas for foreign aid to support the afflicted by poverty, famine, and disease. This person seems to have found a couple of beans and is not sharing. Object number 4. We are now in the Middle Kingdom, at approximately the beginning of the reign of Amenemhat I. A man named Meketre was buried in his rock-cut tomb at the Theban necropolis. Meketre was a well-to-do noble of the pharaoh's court, and he spent a lot of his wealth on his tomb. The tomb had been looted and explored before, but in 1920, an expedition from the New York Metropolitan Museum discovered an untouched, intact chamber full of the most amazing models of Egyptian daily life. These models are typical of Middle Kingdom burials and give us invaluable information regarding boats, housing, shops, construction, and many other aspects of life in ancient Egypt. They are made in order for the tomb owner to show what he wants to do or have in the land of Osiris. A favorite of mine is this model of Meketre counting the cattle with his scribes. It is on display in the Egyptian Museum of Cairo. Meketre is probably the man seated with his son under the covered portico. 4 scribes are taking the count, squatting to the left. A team of men herd the cattle into a single file for counting, while other overseers look on. An accurate count is needed to determine the donations required to the temples and the government. This is obviously a time of prosperity in Egyptian history. Viewing this model, one can easily imagine the auditory environment of the cattle roundup. Object number 5, for whose sake the sun does shine, is written on the buttress of the smaller Abu Simbel temple built for the first queen of Ramses the Great, the greatest pharaoh of the 19th dynasty and perhaps the greatest pharaoh of all time. Queen Nefertari is one of the most well-known women in Egyptian history. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is most spectacular, and I was privileged to see it. In her tomb, researchers found a pair of sandals. I think it is incredible that here we have the sandals that Nefertari may have actually walked in. Examine how finely made they are. The sandals are displayed in the Egyptian Museum of Turin, and I took this photograph. Of course, I could be wrong. Maybe they were left by someone else, or maybe they were made for her after her death as a new pair for hiking in the afterlife, but I prefer the thought of her feet in them. Nefertari lived at the pinnacle of Egyptian power and wealth. Ramses' building program was second to none. We see him everywhere in Egypt, and in fact, many monuments were usurped by him by carving his name over and deeper than the older inscriptions. After the death of Nefertari, Ramses seemed to be different, as if he strove only to impress her in his life. Without Nefertari at his side, he just carried on. Nevertheless, Ramses lived a very long life and reigned for over 66 years. Object number 6. The end of Egyptian history is punctuated by the death of top model Cleopatra. So it is here I will select my last object, the head of Cleopatra at the Antikensammlung in the Altes Museum, Berlin. The photograph is mine. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian, rather a Ptolemaic Greek, but she loved Egypt, the history, and the culture, and she is considered the last pharaoh of Egypt. In the museum, she is strategically located next to a bust of Julius Caesar. Mr. Caesar is forever staring at his lost love.
You talking to me? You talking to me?
Cleopatra knew that Egypt was not a military might and that the flow of power in the world was apparent to her. In order to preserve Egypt, she needed desperately at all costs to effect a deal with Rome, a deal that would keep her in power and Egypt under her rule. She seduced Caesar, and Caesar went head over heels for her. Things were looking good for a while. The plan was working. Then Caesar was assassinated, so she came up with Plan B, and we all know what happened with the Mark Antony story. Octavian marched in, and that was, sadly, the end. The sculpture has thought to have been made around the time when Cleopatra visited Rome with Caesar, either being made in Italy or brought with her from Alexandria. It is claimed to have been found along the Appian Way. Well, that's it. Thank you for watching.
Too many